Hello everyone and welcome to this episode, the podcast one of the Women Talking About Learning podcast. Before we start, if you like women talking about learning and want to help keep the lights on and the tea poured, you can contribute at Ko-Fi. Details are on our website, womentalkingaboutlearning.com, and in the show notes. This is a bit of a meta episode. The idea of people talking about podcasts on a podcast was a bit unusual, but something that we've been asked about a little bit. So, to make sure we cover the topic properly, we've got two women who produce podcasts to guest. Our first guest is Liz Drury. Liz was born and brought up in Northamptonshire, but now lives in rural North Lincolnshire. After working in local television education, she began working as a voiceover artist in 2013 whilst living in the US. In 2017, she was named as one of the UK's top 100 small businesses, which led to an invitation to a reception at 10 Downing Street. And Liz is also the host of the Small Business Big Network podcast, which is for small business owners who want to get more from their networking. Our second guest is Heidi Kirby. Heidi is a learning and development leader, PhD candidate in instructional design and technology at Old Dominion University, and host of The Block, Building Learning and Organisational Culture podcast for L&D professionals. A learning problem solver, Heidi got her start as a college English professor, but has since worked as an instructional designer for NASA, a large health insurance company, a small tech startup, and a software company in her hometown of Cleveland, Ohio. For her PhD program, she's studying leadership competencies that instructional designers need to be successful. This episode was really fun to record, and I'll tell you why at the end. This is Women Talking About Learning. This is Liz and Heidi talking about podcasts.
Hello, Heidi. Whereabouts in the world are you?
I'm in Cleveland, Ohio, US. What about you, Liz?
So I'm in North Lincolnshire in the UK. Isn't it wonderful that we can do these kind of things? And
it is so
talk
great.
to people on the other side of the world.
Yes, it's like one of those happy, if we can take something positive from the pandemic, what would it be? And it's all of the different people that I've talked to all over the world. That's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I've talked to people in Canada this week, in
Awesome.
France this week. And that just wouldn't have happened before the pandemic, I don't think.
No. It's a great way to network.
Yeah, definitely. So we're going to be talking about podcasting today.
Yes. Podcasting on a podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, a podcast about a podcast. Yeah. So I want to know about your podcast and what you do.
Sure. So a little bit about me, background. I started my career as a college English professor and then kind of worked my way into corporate instructional design and started kind of my path to L&D leadership this year. And now I lead a small yet scrappy L&D team for my organization. But last year I was laid off due to the pandemic, and I ended up working as a contractor for a startup. And when I say startup, I mean like 3 other people and myself. Mm-hmm. And part of that was kind of creating the instructional design function for that startup. And so my idea, which I'd been pitching to multiple bosses before this without success, was, hey, let's use a podcast to kind of try and bolster this startup's name and their reputation, right? And so the Block podcast was started, and Block stands for Building Learning and Organizational Culture. And once I left that contracting position, I asked my former boss, hey, can I keep this? Can I just take over the cost, all of the functions of it and keep this podcast? And he was nice enough to let me do that. And so every 2 weeks for over a year now, I've been cranking out the episodes.
That's brilliant. Did you have any experience of podcast or recording or any of that stuff before?
Recording, yes. As an instructional designer, I had done, my own voiceover work because, when you're limited in budget, you have to do your own voiceover. So I had experience editing with Audacity, which is what I still use today. And other than that, no, I had no idea. When I started down the rabbit hole, I was like, wait, you need somewhere to host it. You need this, you need, all of the things that I wasn't aware that I needed to do to have a podcast. Cause mostly I just wanted to start one because it seemed cool and because I was a fan.
Audacity is great, actually, isn't it? I mean, when I started out in the world of voiceover, which is my career, Audacity was the first piece of recording software that I used. I use something else
Great.
these days, but it's free and open to anyone to use. So for anyone who's thinking of starting a podcast and thinking, oh, is it going to be really expensive? It really doesn't need to be, does it?
No, no. A lot of people use Zoom for their podcast too. But I want to stop there and ask you about your podcast.
Sure. So as I've just mentioned, I'm a voiceover artist, and I've been doing this for about 8 years now. And my connection to the field of learning and development is that I narrate a lot of e-learning courses. It's actually one of my favorite things to do because you learn so much while you're doing it.
Yes.
And I've narrated courses for the hospitality industry, for healthcare, for education, for all kinds of different sectors. And it's always really interesting. Even the nuclear waste industry, even if you want to know how to get rid of nuclear waste, I can tell you all about it. And so, working as a voiceover artist, people had suggested to me numerous times, oh, you should do a podcast. And I was like, yeah, but I don't know whether I want to do that. I don't know whether I want the commitment, because once you start doing it, as you know, it's a content hungry beast. You've got to keep feeding it. And I thought, do I want to get into all that? And I mean, although obviously I'm used to recording and editing, I had no idea about how to get the podcast out there, the whole hosting and that kind of stuff. And I thought, oh, there's a big learning curve to go through. Do I really want to do that? And also, I wasn't really sure what my podcast should be about. And I joined a Facebook community about podcasting, which is run by a lady called Anna Parker Naples. She kind of calls herself the podcast queen, or she has been called the podcast queen. And she had a free Facebook group, and she was running a free challenge, a 5-day start your podcast challenge, which I joined in with. And it was all about, looking at what podcasts are out there, what your interests are, how much time you can put into it, etc., etc. And I went through this 5-day challenge, and I still wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. But something that I really enjoyed doing for my business is networking. And, it's one of the main ways that I use to market myself. And so I thought, well, maybe something around networking. And I'm fairly well known within the voiceover industry for networking, and I get asked to speak at conferences about it and that sort of thing. And I thought, well, why not capitalize on that? So I had a look to see what else was out there, because obviously you don't want your podcast to be too similar to something that somebody else is already doing. And what I found was that certainly within the UK, nobody else was doing a podcast about networking. So I thought, okay, there is a bit of a gap in the market here. By the time I got my act together and actually did it, which was several months later, there was one or two other things going on, but they're not quite the same as what I did.
Sure.
And in fact, I've had the hosts of other podcasts about networking on my podcast in here, and I've been on theirs, and it's worked out quite well really. So that's kind of how my podcast came about, really. So did you do research as to whether someone was already doing what you were doing?
Yeah, I did. And really, I feel like there's so many variations. And when you have guests on your podcast, when you choose that format, you're going to run into like similar content and things like that. So I wasn't too much worried about it, because there kind of are a lot of L&D podcasts out there. And so I try to stay to make it a little bit different. I try to stay at kind of like the organizational level and talk about kind of, more organizational things, and, how L&D professionals who are seeking a career can look at organizations and things like that. So I kind of try to zoom out from some of the topics that I've heard, but, kind of like you said, that the hosts of the other networking podcasts and you have like been on each other's shows. That's super common with the L&D podcast. I have friends, Amy Patricic and Leslie Early and Dr. Luke Hobson, who have their own podcasts. I've been on theirs. They've been on mine. It's just kind of, there's also this little like podcasting network in and of itself, where you go on each other's podcast, and then you even share guests, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago now, a real life conference with people in the room. It was amazing. And it was a conference for voiceover artists, and it was down in London. And one of the sessions actually was about podcasting. And the presenter showed a slide with a number of pictures of podcast channel art on, and mine was one of the pictures that she showed, and she'd picked a number of podcasts that were related to voiceover or run by voiceover artists, and I was one of the ones on there. And I looked along the pictures and thought, yeah, I know that person, I know that person, I know that person. And like you say, it's kind of quite a small world actually, but it's growing though, isn't it?
It is. It's easier now than ever, I feel like, to start a podcast. So what advice would you give to someone who's kind of like in the stage that we were when we were experimenting with the should we, shouldn't we, what is this going to take?
I think my advice is just get on with it. To be honest, that's the advice I would give to myself, a year ago, where I was dithering about it, because I just, like I said before, I was worried about how much time it was going to take up, and actually it doesn't. The format that I've chosen is sometimes I will do a short episode where it's just me talking into the microphone. Most of the time I have a guest. And it's very much like we're talking now, really. I just let the conversation flow. I have an outline of some questions that I would tell the guest in advance. This is what I'm planning to ask you. And it's never anything very, very difficult, but we might go off on tangents and so on. And I generally don't do too much editing to it afterwards, because I like it to sound like a natural conversation, like, the listener is eavesdropping on our conversation, like we're having now. And so it doesn't take up too much time. I mean, I know people who have podcasts that are all singing or dancing, and they edit it massively and put in lots of sound effects and lots of music and so on, and they sound brilliant, but I really don't have time for that. So
yes,
kind of warts and all. So I've had episodes where the dog has started barking, either my dog or the guest dog, or there's been a vacuum cleaner in the background, or traffic going past, or whatever. I was interviewing John Hinchliffe, who we both know quite well from the L&D, the global L&D community. And I was interviewing him for my podcast, and his wife had the hairdryer going in the background. So
that's great.
It's kind of like people get to people can really sort of visualize you in your domestic surroundings, I think, when you get all these background noises. And we've all, a lot of us have been working from home over the last year anyway, so I think we're all kind of used to that now, aren't we?
For sure.
Back to your original question. Yeah, my advice is get on with it, and don't just jump in, really. And there's not as much to learn as you think there is. It's not as hard to do as you think it might be. And I'm finding it not too difficult to get guests to come on, and I've usually got at least sort of 4 weeks in the bank, so I've got a bit of a buffer, and I'm not thinking, oh no, I've got to put a podcast out tomorrow, what do I need to do? That I haven't come to that yet.
Well, that's good, because I feel like that's where I live. But no, I really like that advice of just get on with it. I think that I would tell people that it's not as involved or as expensive as you think it is. You said that you kind of do light editing. When I first started, I edited out every single that every guest said. If you go back and listen to the first 3 episodes of my podcast and then listen to a more recent one, if you listen for it, you're gonna notice the difference. But what I found is that when I listen to other people's podcasts, I don't notice that background noise. I don't notice the ums. I'm thinking about what they're saying. And so when I kind of realized that, that's when I stopped editing so heavily, and it saves you a ton of time. Yeah. But if you use a tool like Audacity to edit, if you find I don't know if there's any posting websites are really cheap and affordable. And then if you use Zoom, or if you use Audacity. Those are both very, you could use the free Zoom subscription and do less than 45-minute episodes. So you can do a podcast for very little money. And I don't think a lot of people realize that.
Yeah, that's right. And something that I was worried about when I started was there's so many different podcast platforms. How do I get my podcast into all those places? But I use something called Captivate, and that just does it all for me. So I just upload it in one place and it pushes it out everywhere else. And I think if I'd realized that earlier on, I may have done things a bit quicker than I did.
For sure. Yeah. I use a hosting platform called Buzzsprout. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. But it's the plan that I use because I'm not, doing like a weekly show or anything. I think it's like 5 hours of content a month for $12 a month. And like you said, it pushes it out to all the different directories. So it puts it on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Anchor and Google and all of those different places where podcasts live. So I don't even have to do any of that. And it records all the stats for me. So I don't even have to keep track of those.
Yeah, the Captivate does a similar thing. So so you said you don't do yours weekly. How often does your podcast come out?
I do it bi-weekly. I felt like that was a good cadence for me. And you said you have like this bank of like 4 weeks worth of podcast guests where I'm always kind of scrambling at the last minute going, okay, I'm recording on Saturday night for my Tuesday morning episode. And that's just how I do it.
And how long do your episodes
going on? But I find that typically they are, well, you know what, when I started, I didn't have a specific time frame. So I kind of let people talk, but then I found that the episodes that are like closer to don't get nearly as many downloads as the ones that are less than a half an hour. I don't know if you found something similar.
Yeah, none of mine have been particularly long. The episodes that I do myself tend to be under 10 minutes. And the ones where I'm talking to a guest tend to be around the 20-minute mark. I tend to listen to podcasts when I'm walking the dog or doing the dishes or something like that.
Yeah.
And so, I don't tend to listen to podcasts myself that are really long. So I kind of think my audience probably don't want to be that long either.
Right. Or, unfortunately, I don't listen to nearly as many podcasts as I did when I had a commute because the podcast is the thing I listened to on the commute. So it was, that 25 minutes was whatever I could listen to within that 25 minutes. That was my commute. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. A lot of people listen to podcasts when they're commuting. And I wonder whether podcast listenership went down last year because so many people were not commuting anymore. They were working from home or they were furloughed. And so at the same time, because people perhaps had more spare time because they weren't commuting, maybe more people have been making podcasts.
Yeah. So there's probably an increase in hosts and a decrease in listening maybe, but I have tried to, as there are more and more podcasts coming out, I've tried to listen more just at home while I'm working because I am working from home. So it is relatively easy still to kind of, to still put it on in the background. But I have a fun question for you now, Liz. This is what I like to ask other podcast hosts. How did you choose the music for your intro?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. So I was kind of lucky in a way in that because I'm a voiceover artist and sometimes my clients ask me to add music to the narration that I'm doing for them or other kind of sound effects. I have a subscription to a website called Studio Blocks. I want to say it's called Audio Blocks. They've changed
Yeah.
the name of it. And so that is full of jingles and short pieces of music that are royalty free, so you don't have to pay anything for them. So I pay a subscription to the site, but I don't pay for the individual pieces of music. And I think I just went in there with some search terms like upbeat, corporate, something like that, and I listened to various pieces of music and thought, oh yeah, I think that fits what I'm doing. How about you?
I did the same thing. I went through and kind of scoured all of the royalty-free music websites, and there was a lot of things that sounded like similar, like almost like that very like jingly, upbeat realty commercials when you're looking to buy a house. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Like that feel good. And I was like, no, this sounds like everything else. I want something very unique. And then I found what my husband says sounds like the Austin Powers theme song for mine. It's like very like 60s groovy. And I heard it, and the song itself is called Jelly Donut.
Oh, cool.
And I was like, in so many ways, this just represents like the fun, like not taking myself too seriously kind of tone and vibe that I was going for.
Yeah. I think it's a good idea though to have some kind of music to introduce your podcast, because the rest of the podcast usually is people talking, and it just gives a nice kind of definite beginning and end to it. Some podcasts that I've dipped in and out of when I was doing my research literally just go straight into the episode, and you're kind of like, oh, okay, have we started then? And I think it's a little bit more it sounds a bit more professional, I think, to have an intro and outro.
I agree. Yeah, I kind of bookend my podcast in the same way every time. I have like the music, then I do my brief intro. Well, actually, I'm sorry, when I do a guest episode, I put like one like 10-second quote from the guest at the very beginning that kind of sums up the feel of the episode. And I'll put that at the very beginning, and then I'll put the music, and then I'll put the intro, and then we go into the episode. And I end it the same way every time too, with like I ask the same question of all of my guests. And then I do I have just like a recorded thanks for listening that it was pre-recorded, and I just stick it in at the end of every single podcast. What about you?
Yeah, pretty much the same. So I have a pre-recorded intro and outro. So the introduction, says who I am and what the podcast is and who it's for. Then I will then have an introduction to that episode, which doesn't have any music behind it. And what I do is I will record the interview with a guest, and I'll say to them, I'm going to record the introduction later on after you've gone, when I know what we've spoken about. So that goes next. Then there's the interview, and at the end is the pre-recorded exit saying, thanks for listening, and please subscribe and rate and review and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, tell all your friends.
Yeah. So Heidi, I've got a question for you now. How do you find your guests?
Oh, that's a really good question. So when my podcast first started, it was definitely just me bothering all of my friends that I knew in L&D. And so my first 3 episodes were a fellow PhD student from my program, my former manager, and then kind of a new friend in my network that I had met at the time. And I had just kind of pinged all of them and asked them if they'd be willing. And then I kind of went through down my friends list, but now it's to the point where my podcast has grown and has, kind of gotten this small following and is kind of becoming a little bit more well-known in the L&D community. And so every once in a while, I'll put out a post on LinkedIn or something that says, hey, if you know somebody who would be a good guest on my podcast, or if you want to be a guest, let me know. And that's actually generated quite a few different guests and people I hadn't met previously. I also have a Google form at the kind of top of my LinkedIn where people can, go and fill out if they want to be a guest or if they know someone who would be a good guest. And then now I have people who will hear an episode where someone's promoting either their program or their book or something, because, you know, part of the reason I do this is to let people promote their stuff.
Yeah.
And, you know, they'll be like, hey, I've done this thing, or I'm working on this cool project, or I just started this cool thing, and I'd love to come on your show and promote it. So now I've got like people approaching me saying, I'd love to come on your podcast. I'm like, whoa, is this really happening? What about you?
Yeah, pretty much the same. Yeah, when I started, I sort of made a list of people that I knew who would
Yes.
make good guests, and I you know, I approached them, and they were my first guests, and same kind of thing. You know, I've reached out on social media. I attend a lot of networking meetings, which have largely been online, of course, over the last year, and I always post in the chat box that I have a podcast, I'm looking for guests, so that generates guests that way. And like you, I'm at the point now where people do approach me, and I interviewed somebody last week who she's got a book coming out in October that she was wanting to promote, so she was very keen to come on. But I don't know whether you find this too. I do get approached by really random people who send me an email, and it's often not them themselves. It'll be like their PA or something sending me an email saying, you know, such and such a person I thought would make a great guest for the small business big network podcast, and then they go on to say what this person does. It's like nothing to do with my podcast at all, and I think they just go through podcasts and just fire off emails to all of them.
I definitely don't get those requests. I think because mine is such a niche market with L&D, where yours is kind of, you know, you've got that small business angle, you've got other entrepreneurs trying to get their name out there. But I do get like, I do get people who see that someone has like sold a product or a service through my podcast and has promoted it. And so they're like, I want to come on your podcast and promote X. And I'm like, I don't know you, and I don't know what this is. And I'm not sure if it's quality or not. And so, you know, there is kind of a vetting process, right? There is kind of you have to know the person, you have to know their body of work. You have to, you know, believe in whatever it is they're coming on to promote.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, it's like you, I'm quite happy for people to come on and promote what they're doing, you know, the book they've got coming out or so on. But you don't want that to be every episode, do you? Otherwise it just becomes, you know, people are going to switch off because they think, oh, she's trying something again.
Yeah. So you have to kind of change it up from, okay, this one's going to be more of kind of promoting, but this one's going to be just about cool projects that people are working on and cool work that people have done.
Yeah, definitely. So do you think that being a female podcast host makes a difference to anything at all?
You know, I think it does. And I think that there's actually kind of a positive support group for females in podcasting. So when I first started my podcast, one of my influences was a leadership podcast. Of course I can't remember the name of it on the spot right now. But I had reached out to the gal who hosted it and had let her know that like she had inspired me to start a podcast. And she told me about this Women in Podcasting Facebook group that was out there. And so that was nice, but that was kind of more of like there was a lot of people on there doing like mental health and wellness and true crime podcasts, right? Like the very popular content topics for podcasts. So there weren't a lot of people doing what I was doing. And then probably about 6 months ago now, I want to say, a few people in my network, Erica Zimmer, Amy Patricic, and Leslie Early, who all have their own L&D podcasts, reached out and said, hey, we should start a monthly just chat where we all just get together and talk about being a female and doing an L&D podcast. And that has helped so tremendously, just finding that small group of other podcast hosts who are doing the exact same topics and the exact same content. And we share branding ideas. We share marketing ideas. We share guest ideas. We talk about things like, how do we get our guests to be more diverse? You know, how do we find people who are a little bit different to talk to. Hey, is there someone that you've talked to that you think I should talk to, and things like that. We talk about how to focus our podcast more. We give each other encouragement on, whether we should take a break or keep going or do a new season or things like that. And it's just been a really supportive, amazing group. And it's helped me, I'm like, hey, can I steal this idea and use it for my podcast? And so, I've come up with, I now when I release a podcast episode, I just make a little quote in Canva from the guest, the same quote that I use at the beginning of my episode, and I post that on LinkedIn. That was an idea that those gals gave me that I just wasn't doing before because I just didn't have the time or didn't think of it. And I think that that's been a really positive thing for women in podcasting in general, because the other thing I noticed is that it just seems so easy and flawless for all of the gentlemen I know who host podcasts, right? They do very little editing. And that was one of the things that also made me stop heavy editing, was realizing that they just some of these guys just kind of seem like they throw it together. And I feel like I've spent so much time trying to make it perfect, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's something else that made me sort of dither about starting it, was the whole trying to make it perfect. I think particularly because, of course, I'm in the audio industry, and so
yes,
people probably expect a certain level of audio quality. And although my audio is good, I have no control really over the quality of the guest's audio, and I'm sure you probably have the same issue. And sometimes I can't even pinpoint why it is that their audio doesn't sound good. And I guess it's just because of the space they're recording in. I'm recording in a dedicated vocal booth, which, of course, my guests don't have. They're just ordinary business people. And I always say to my guests, you need to wear headphones, and if you've got an external mic, that would be ideal. And you try and have a quiet background, but sometimes it's just not possible. And it ends up where there's a real noticeable difference between the quality of my audio and the quality of the guests. But I think, do you know what? As long as the content's good, I'm gonna live with it and not worry too much about the fact that it isn't pristine audio, because my guests aren't voiceover artists and they don't have the equipment and the background that I do. And I think it's okay.
Yeah, for sure. No, I've listened to a couple of your episodes before this just to do some research, and I'm like, wow. I always joke and say that mine is a very amateur podcast, that it's not super polished, that it's very off the cuff, and then I listened to yours and I was like, yeah, she definitely knows what she's doing.
That's very
she's
kind
definitely a professional.
I don't always feel like it. Especially when sometimes at the start of an episode we just can't get the technology to work.
Yes,
that happens. I think that you said that you use Zoom for recording. I use a platform called CleanFeed, which is audio only, and that it's great. Okay. And the audio quality is better than I can get from Zoom. But of course, the downside of an audio only platform is I can't see the guest. And so sometimes, I'm sitting there and I can see they're trying to connect and it's not working, but I can't see them. And I also can't speak to them because connection hasn't worked. And then we have to go back to emailing and say, like, try this, try that.
Oh, man. Yeah, so I don't use Zoom. That's just what I recommend to people getting started. Right. I actually use Squadcast. I'm not sure if you've heard of that one.
Yeah, I have heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that does allow me to do video. They've actually just recently allowed you to now record video, but it used to be that you were just on video and recording audio only.
Right.
But the video piece was just so that you could have that conversation. And I found that to be like a very helpful thing, to be able to see the other person and feel like you're actually having a conversation or having a chat.
Yeah. I mean, I do love CleanFeed, and there are two versions of it. I have the free version, which works. Oh, great. Which works fine for recording podcasts. You can get a paid version, and the difference is the paid version allows you to record you and your guests on different channels, so you end up with two, an audio file for each. Whereas the free version, I just get one audio file and it's both of us in there, and that's usually okay. I mean, I have actually even used it with my community theatre group during the lockdown. We recorded some like radio plays, audio dramas,
cool.
and we had 6 or 7 people on the line, and it worked fine.
That's awesome. So let me ask you this. Do you have a favorite episode of your podcast?
Do I have a favorite? I just recorded a really good one this week, which won't be going out until end of October, beginning of November, with a guy that I met some years ago. And he's a marketeer, and he's a public speaker. And one of his companies that he co-founded is involved in the next moon landing, and basically selling advertising space on the rocket, from what I can gather.
What?
It's incredible. And he's just a fascinating guy. I mean, he worked on a project here with Coca-Cola a few years ago, which is called Share a Coke or something, and all these Coke bottles with people's names on were produced, and you could find your own name, among the Coke bottles on the shelf. He was involved in that, and so he's got some fascinating stories, and he was just so interesting to talk to. And the episodes that I like the best are the ones where the guests just talk and you don't have to do much work. And I could ask him a question and he would just go. So those are my favorite episodes. The one with John Hinchliffe was really good actually as well. He's another person, he will just talk.
He's great.
And and as I say, we had the hairdryer in the background just for added atmosphere on that one.
White noise.
Yeah. How about you? Do you have a favorite?
I think if I had to pick, it would be those first 3 episodes. And the reason is because when I was doing kind of all my research to get the podcast started, it was saying that you should release multiple episodes when you launch your podcast at once, so that you can get like a spike in listenership, right? And so I released 3 episodes together, but I recorded them all on the same day because I was off of work that day. And I just remember being so nervous leading up to it, and then recording all 3 and just feeling like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. I could do this all day, every day. And I feel that way when I get off the call with every single guest, but I think it was just amplified in that initial recording space, right?
Yeah. And like you, I had been told to release 3 episodes at once to start with, and just to help you kind of get traction. So if someone goes to your podcast page, they can see that you've got more than 1 episode, and they can listen to the episodes back to back to really get a flavor of what's going to be coming. And I don't know whether you did this as well, but when my podcast launched, I sort of went all out on the marketing of it, and it was all over LinkedIn and Facebook, and I was emailing people and getting people to subscribe and rate and review and so on. And that did help my podcast get to number 5 in the Apple marketing podcast charts, which was amazing.
That is incredible. Good for you.
It's never been anywhere near there again, but I can say it's a top 5 podcast.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great accolade.
So what plans do you have for your podcast going forward?
Mostly right now it's just to keep it going. I have started to unashamedly ask people to come on it, like big people, like pretty important people in the L&D fields. And mostly they've been pretty gracious. What I found is people like being asked to be on a podcast. People find that flattering. So that's really my thing, is to just kind of keep getting more guests and keep it going is the biggest thing. What about you?
Yeah, the same thing, really, just to keep it going. And I do still have a list of people to contact who I think would make good guests. So I think there's some life in it. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. Well, I've really enjoyed talking to you about what we do and what we enjoy doing just for fun, you know?
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it's been great chatting to you, Heidi.
You too, Liz.
Take care.
You too.
I felt like a nodding dog throughout this session. The way Liz and Heidi covered the topic was brilliant, especially in the face of the challenges that we had. First up, a transformer blew in Heidi's hometown and she lost all power and all Wi-Fi. A bit later, Liz's dog decided to join in the podcast and contributed until they'd been fed. And as Liz and Heidi said, you only want to edit lightly. So, apart from these interruptions, the episode is their whole conversation. A massive thanks to both Liz and Heidi for such a great episode. As always, their details and the links we discussed are in the show notes. Remember to share, like and subscribe to the podcast. We appreciate everyone who listens and contributes to help make this podcast such a cool thing to do. As always, thank you for listening, and we'll see you again soon.